On January 6, 2021, a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol. It was a day that shook America, and honestly, it's still one of the most intense and fiercely debated moments in recent memory. It made a lot of people ask some really tough questions about the stability of U.S. democracy. So let's break down exactly what happened and what it all means.
I mean, just look at this. This was the scene inside the Capitol building. It was a truly unprecedented assault on the very seat of American government. The last time the building was breached was during the War of 1812, but this wasn't a foreign army. This was a domestic mob trying to stop the peaceful transfer of power.
So, to really get our heads around this, we're going to walk through it in 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the attack itself. Then, we'll dive into the immediate aftermath and the huge quest for accountability. After that, we'll examine how the nation is still so divided over what it all means. And finally, what this moment tells us about democracy at a crossroads. All right, so let's start at the beginning. How did a political rally turn into a full-blown violent assault on the U.S. Capitol? Let's just walk through the timeline of that day. The day just escalated with shocking speed. What started as a march, well, it quickly devolved into total chaos as the outer barricades were just overwhelmed. By 2:15 in the afternoon, they were inside the building. For hours, you had lawmakers literally hiding while rioters fought with police. It actually wasn't until later that evening that the building was finally secured, which allowed Congress to reconvene and, pretty defiantly, finish their constitutional duty. And the human cost for the police was just immense. We're talking more than 140 officers assaulted and injured. Some had concussions, others had chemical burns. They were caught in hours of brutal hand-to-hand combat just trying to defend the building. So, in the days right after the attack, the whole thing triggered a really swift and historic response from Washington. The political fallout was immediate. For the first time ever, a U.S. president was impeached twice. Now, the Senate did ultimately acquit him, but the vote to convict was actually the most bipartisan in presidential history. At the same time, Trump was kicked off major social media platforms, and an early attempt to create a big independent investigation was blocked. This quote from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi just a week after the attack really shows you how seriously the leadership in Congress was taking this. Her words didn't frame it as just a protest that got out of hand. She called it an armed rebellion, instigated from the very top. And that brings us to the search for accountability. The attack kicked off what's been called the single largest criminal investigation in American history. No exaggeration. I mean, the scale is just staggering. As of early 2024, the Justice Department has charged over 1,200 people from pretty much every single state. The charges run the gamut from misdemeanors to really serious felonies, which just paints a picture of how widespread this event was. And to go after the organizers, the Justice Department had to dust off this incredibly serious and rarely used charge from the Civil War era: seditious conspiracy. By bringing this charge against leaders of groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, prosecutors were signaling that they saw this as a coordinated plot to forcibly stop the government from functioning. And the consequences of those charges? They've been severe. Enrique Tarrio, a leader of the Proud Boys, got a 22-year prison sentence. That's the longest sentence for any defendant, and it really shows how seriously the courts are taking these convictions for orchestrating the attack. Now, beyond the individual rioters, a congressional committee spent 18 months conducting its own deep dive investigation. After more than 1,000 interviews, its main finding was crystal clear. January 6th wasn't just some spontaneous riot. They concluded it was the violent end of a deliberate, multi-part plan by the former president to stay in power. So, in response to all of this, Congress actually took concrete action. Republicans and Democrats worked together to pass the Electoral Count Reform Act. What this law does is basically strengthen the rules for certifying an election, making it much, much harder for anyone to try and exploit the kinds of loopholes that were targeted back in 2020. But this leads us to our next section, a nation divided. Because while the legal and political gears were turning in Washington, a fierce battle over the story of January 6th was just getting started out in the rest of the country. And what's emerged are 2 fundamentally different realities. On one hand, you have the official account, backed up by all the investigations and court cases, which says it was a violent insurrection. But on the other hand, a really powerful counter-narrative has taken root, that it was either a legitimate protest or maybe even a setup by federal agents. You can see this deep split in the polling data. A quarter of all Americans and nearly half of Trump voters believe the totally debunked theory that the FBI orchestrated the attack. That just shows a profound disagreement in how the country is seeing the same set of facts. This shift even became official in a way. In early 2022, the Republican National Committee, the party's main governing body, passed a resolution that actually described the events of January 6th as legitimate political discourse. That was a huge step in officially reframing the violence of that day. But that view wasn't universal inside the party, not by a long shot. The top Republican in the Senate at the time, Mitch McConnell, came right out and rebuked the RNC. He stuck with his original assessment, calling the attack a violent insurrection, which really highlighted a deep crack among Republicans over how to remember that day. And the former president has been right at the center of this reframing effort. By calling the jailed rioters hostages and promising to pardon them, he's actively trying to change their public image from criminals who attacked their government into political prisoners and even patriots. So, finally, where does this all leave us? Let's turn to Section 5, Democracy's Crossroads. What did this huge stress test actually reveal about the American system? Well, the system bent, but it didn't break. And it was because key people and institutions held the line. You had police officers who defended the building. You had judges and election officials from both parties who refused to give in to pressure. The vice president didn't overstep his constitutional role, and in the end, Congress got the job done. So this brings us to the biggest question of all about the legacy of January 6th. The future of how we remember this is still being written. Is it going to be a stark warning about how fragile democracy can be? Or will the efforts to downplay it, to excuse it, actually succeed and maybe even normalize this kind of political violence? Ultimately, the story of January 6th isn't just about the past. It's an ongoing challenge for right now. The event is this really stark reminder that democracy isn't something that's just guaranteed by old documents. It depends on all of us having a shared commitment to the process, to a common set of facts, and to the rule of law, especially when we don't like the outcome.